Good evening. This is the Chapter 8 review for the Chapter 8 test tomorrow in Social Studies. I do want to remind the kids, this is, guys, I'm not trying to trick you or anything. This is directly from my test that I created the review. So this is all information we have covered throughout Chapter 8, either in our notes, our readings, or discussions. So we're going to help guide you through this. If you needed somebody to kind of give you a review for the test, this is your opportunity to take advantage of that. We are going to start with key vocabulary for Chapter 8. These are terms you need to know, not just recognize, not be able to just say, oh yeah, enslaved Africans was a word from Chapter 8. You need to know the word enslaved Africans. What does it mean? Can you use it in a sentence that has its meaning? So for example, if I just gave you a sentence and said, people who work on plantations are called. Well, there's a lot of people that work on plantations. You wouldn't pull enslaved Africans out of a sentence like that. But if I said to you, people who were captured in Africa and brought to America to work on plantations are called blank, you should be able to recognize, okay, that's enslaved Africans. Okay, so that's what we're looking for as far as practicing for these. So in your Chapter 8 review, if you're looking at it right now and you really do need it out while we're doing this, I'm going to give you the 3 vocabulary words, and I would like you to, after I give you the word, hit pause, see if you know the definition, compare it to your SWORD 8, and then following I will talk about the definition, so if you weren't getting it, you should still have it. Remember, Chapter 8's review, and yes, I know it's mirrored, Chapter 8's review is due tomorrow for the test. It's taking the time to practice, guys. Sitting down and not just saying, yeah, I looked it over, but actually taking the time to say, do I know this stuff? Asking yourself the question, seeing if you can answer it. If you don't have the right answers, going in and checking it. Because, guys, this is coming from the book. It's coming from your notes. You're going to be doing this with me right now. So in the end, there's really no excuse to have wrong answers and incorrect information for the test tomorrow. So here we go. Number 1, enslaved Africans. Tell me what about enslaved Africans. Go. Hit pause. See if you know this. Okay, and you should be back. Enslaved Africans, remember we're talking about people from Africa who were captured, sold, traded in Africa. They were brought to the coast, put on board ships for the Middle Passage, brought over to America where they were then sold to work on the plantations for the rest of their lives. They're enslaved. That's different than how they were being treated in Africa, where they were more treated, you know, they're still servants, but they were considered part of the family and part of the family structure. In America, it's that true definition of slavery where you're working for the family, you're working day after day, 16-hour days in the fields. Essentially, you're being worked to death. It really is that severe. All right, here we go. Number 2, dilemma. Tell me about a dilemma. Hit pause and do that, please. Okay, and you should be back. A dilemma. One of the students in one of the classes, for privacy's sake here, gave us an example that she had been to a bridal store and that a young lady there was complaining, oh, I have a dilemma. I can't pick a wedding dress. That's an incorrect use of the word dilemma because she is going to leave that store with a dress and she's going to be happy with whatever dress she picks. In a dilemma, you're being forced to make a choice. And no matter what choice you make, you are not going to profit from that choice. Its outcome is not going to be good for you. It's going to be a poor outcome for you. So in a dilemma, you're not going to, it's not going to turn out well for you, no matter which choice you have to make. And in this chapter, we had 9 different dilemmas, 3 from Africa, 3 on the Middle Passage, and 3 from arrival in America that you had to be aware of for each of those situations. Okay, number 3, Middle Passage. Tell me about the Middle Passage. Go ahead and hit pause. Okay, and hopefully you're back. Middle Passage. So, Middle Passage is that second part of an enslaved African's trip to America. They've already taken the trip from their home to the African coast, the West African coast, where they are branded, they're loaded onto the ships, and that trip from Western Africa to America, that is the Middle Passage. You need to know the difficulties involved. We've all talked about the fact they could smell these ships coming before they could actually see them. The conditions on board were terrible. Okay, and you need to know that about the Middle Passage. It should be part of your description of it. Now, I'm giving you a description of it myself right now, but in your words, you need to be putting that on your Chapter 8 review, and you need to be able to express that yourself, okay? All right, here we go. Key facts. Number 1, what reasons did Europeans have for enslaving the Africans? What reason did the Europeans use, or what reason did they give for why they needed to have slaves from Africa? Another way to say it. I'm going to hit pause. Go ahead. See if you can answer that. Okay. All right. What did you say? Hopefully you talked about the plantations, that there were these crops that were being grown in America that needed a huge labor force. The plantations needed such a large labor force that honestly there weren't enough people from Europe in America to even start to fill those needs on these huge plantations. We're talking hundreds of thousands of acres. And plants like tobacco and cotton that are all about manual labor. Because of that, the Europeans were looking for a workforce, and they saw in the Western Africans an opportunity for a workforce that seemed to already be built in. That because Africa already had a slave trade, they just saw it as a way of, okay, we're going to take advantage of that, and we ourselves are going to become part of that trade. Number 2. What item or items did Europeans trade for the slaves? Okay. Okay, what'd you say here? Hopefully you talked about, and again, guys, the process here is I'm asking you the question. Make sure you're hitting pause, attempting to answer it yourself, and then checking your answer against mine. I would do this video twice if you're finding my answers aren't matching up with yours yet, Mr. V. Because if they aren't, then you really need to go back and try it again, okay? What items did Europeans trade for the slaves? They traded things like weapons, specifically guns, muskets. These were used for attacking other villages and catching more slaves. They were trading items like clothing. We saw wool clothing being a big traded item. We talked about blankets, for example, as part of that. They're trading items like rum, which the Western Africans didn't have, so it was something they were willing to trade for. They were willing to trade for anything European, cast iron pots and pans. In some ways, the trade is very similar to what they were trading with the Native Americans for furs and for other supplies from America. Okay, number 3, I'm going to read you a statement. Your answer is yes or no, or true or false. Which of the following occurred to the slaves on the Middle Passage? Choose Y for yes, and for no is what the direction was on your paper. You're just telling me yes or no, this was something that the slaves did. So, number 1, slaves had little to no exercise. Yes or no? All right. Hopefully you said yes, that's true. Remember, they are chained down to the decks. It's only in that last week that they start bringing them up on deck, starting to move them around a little, get them loosened back up, start building up their muscles again. So the answer to that is very much true. There was little to no exercise. Next one, little room to move due to packing conditions. The way they had packed the slaves down, what I'm saying is they left them little room to move or to shift around or get comfortable. And of course that is right. Yes, there was little room to move due to packing conditions. That's very true. By the way, hopefully you're using this to check your answers as well. that you're going through these and saying, yeah, you know, that's what I said too, or that's not what I had. I need to fix that, and now I'll go back and study it again. Next one, the doctors on board provided health care for those who were sick. No. No. If you were sick, you had to get over it somehow. If you died, remember, they threw you overboard. We talked about the fact that many sharks followed the ships right across from Africa. The Middle Passage was not a good thing, guys. Slaves were allowed to choose not to eat as a way of rebellion. Okay, what do you think? That's right. No, they weren't allowed to choose not to eat. We read that one of the ways they would get them to eat, they would put hot coals on their lips to force their mouths open. They would shove food in their mouth, close their mouth, force them to swallow. They would literally force them to eat. You got to remember, these people were worth a lot of money to these sailors. You know, they wanted them to get across alive. So if somebody was intentionally trying not to eat, they'd make sure they ate. Next one, the smells of the ship were terrible, yes or no? Absolutely what? Good. Yes. Yes, the smells would have been terrible. We talked about there are records that show people's journals in cities like Charleston saying they knew the slave ships were coming in before they even saw them come in. The smell would have been terrible because you've got 400 plus people on board a ship with no waste removal. Not to be gross, but that's just what it was. Next, yes or no, people were chained together. Right. Yes, they were chained together. That was a way of controlling the population, so if there was a revolt, they could easily knock it down and stop it. And finally, slaves were allowed to roam the ship. Yes or no? Remember, roam means they could walk around wherever they wanted. And that's right. No, they weren't. They weren't allowed to do that. They were actually chained right down. We had you guys actually act out a tight pack or a loose pack. And hope you guys figured out, yeah, you weren't moving around at all. Okay, number 4. What 3 things happened to a slave in his or her first year in America? First thing to happen to you was what? Okay, hopefully you said you were sold on the auction block or in a scramble. You need to know those two, an auction block versus scramble. All right, so the first thing is you're sold. Second thing they would do, right, they would give you a new name. Whether you liked it or not, they gave you a new name. Third thing they would do, good, right, they would start the seasoning process, which was a year-long process of training you for the job you were going to do on the plantation. Okay, very good. And that leads us to number 5, if you'll flip with me to the back. Number 5 asks, what happened to the slaves who resisted this breaking in or seasoning period? So they're trying to teach you how to use a hoe or a rake, and you just refuse to do it. Okay? You refuse to do it. This comes from 8.7, actually, if you're looking for where it was in the book. What could they do to you? Yeah, this is where the plantation life was quite violent, that first year especially. Right, they could whip you, they would beat you. There's records of them using hot pokers or burning you. When they say they're burning them, that's what they mean by it. And unfortunately, sometimes slaves didn't survive this period, and some were killed, actually. Okay. That's not common, though, and I think sometimes we focus on that part because we think of the slavery in the 1800s when it was much more violent because of the size of the plantations. Remember we talked about slaves are quite valuable to their owners. That's not your goal to have them injured or not able to work. So they were really trying to get them trained to work on the plantation. Okay, number 6, 7, and 8. You have to go into your notes now, and for each part of the journey to America, from Africa, across the Middle Passage, to America, there are decisions that had to be made by people, and these were the dilemmas we talked about. So, for example, if you were in Africa, if you look at number 2 in your notes, and this is what the 3 spots were for on number 6. In Africa, when the Europeans came to you and said, if you were a slave, or a tribal leader or a national leader, if you're in a country in Africa, and they came to you and they said, we'd like you to start the slave trade. Would you trade with us? You were really, at that point, you had 3 real choices. You could do it or not do it, and there are 2 ways you could do it. So option 1, if you look at your letter A, hopefully you said, first choice was, I'm not going to take part in the slave trade. Don't come see me, Mr. Man from Europe. I don't want anything to do with this. Okay, and I want you to understand that those are the choices. So the choices were, don't trade at all, attack another country, attack another tribe, attack another group, and try to take them in to trade as slaves. Or, and this, remember, is not a good one for them because servants in the household were considered part of the family. So to trade a servant was like trading a family member. But option 3 was, if we don't have anyone else to trade and we can't attack any of our neighbors, but we need the weapons in order to defend ourselves, we're going to trade our own servants that are in our village or in our city or in our country, depending on how big the group was, that we will trade these people. But remember, that really affects their family structure, and that is a psychological, that's a morale destroyer. So those were your 3 options. Then I wanted you to think about, okay, and we talked about these. What is the result of that choice? So if I choose not to trade, so my letter A is I will not trade. The result could be I could be attacked by another tribe and taken as slaves myself. I have no way of defending myself. I have no weapons, no modern weapons to protect myself. So again, this is a dilemma because all 3 of these choices, and you're kind of being forced in the choice. You got to do something. All 3 of them have negative costs to them. You're going to be hurt by them, whatever choice you do go with. Choice number 2, you might say, okay, well, then we're going to attack our neighbors. Well, if I attack my neighbors, that essentially means I'm declaring war on them. There is the potential I could lose that, in which case I become a slave. I could lose family members in the fighting. I could lose members of my countrymen in the fighting. So there's a negative effect. Option 3, again, that's going to affect your family in many ways because these servants that you're trading off, besides the fact you're trading off members of your family, essentially, you're also doing the damage of, you are reducing the number of people in your tribe or in your country or however big your group is. You're reducing the amount of defense you have. You're taking away from your ability to protect yourself if someone else attacks you as well. Okay? Number 7 asks, what are your 3 choices if you're on the Middle Passage for that 8 to 12 weeks of captivity on board ship? And again, this came from number 6. There are 3, if you're asking yourself, what can I do about this? I've got to do something. You really only had 3 choices. And again, they're a dilemma because none of them end well for you. Option 1 was, I'm going to refuse to eat. I'm going to try to starve to death. And that'll show them that's going to stop this from happening to me. But as we know, again, talking about results now, what's the result of that choice? It's kind of like we talk about in DARE. When you make a choice, evaluate what's going to happen because of that choice. Well, they're going to force feed you. That's when they would lay the hot coals on your lips to force your mouth open to force food into you. They're not going to let you intentionally harm yourself. You're worth too much money to these sailors when you get to America for sale if you're a slave. So A, you're going to go through great pain, you're going to be forced to eat, and you're still going to have to live through this trip on the Middle Passage. B, remember, was I'm going to revolt. I'm going to take the ship. Well, what is the result of that? You're going to be attacking sailors who are well armed. And very few times did the slaves who revolted really succeed. We talked about the one with the Amistad, that was in the 1800s, but it's very rare they would succeed. It doesn't end well for you. Third option, of course, was I'm going to just bear through this. I'm going to do what it takes to survive. Okay, and hopefully that's what you had down, and hopefully you know that. Now, I'm giving these to you because in a moment I'm going to go back and say to you, okay, now you tell me about these, just like I'm telling you about them now. Because if you can do that, then you're ready for the test. Option 3, again, though, you now have to survive the middle passage. You have to survive the smells, you have to survive the sickness, you have to survive the awful food, the poor treatment, laying in the dark on your side, the sores. You can say, man, you know what, there are a lot of negatives to that. And then number 8, you're in America now. You're on your plantation. What are your 3 choices once you're on the plantation? 1, we said, and this is number 10 in your notes, by the way. Number 1, we said your choice was, I can try to escape. Problem being, if I'm caught, and back in the 1700s you are likely to be caught, if I am caught, they are going to, in front of all the other slaves in the plantation, in order to make a point, they're going to beat me. They're going to whip me for this because they want to make a point to the other slaves. Don't try to escape. It's going to be very public what they're going to do to me. Second choice is when, and this seems to be the one that history-wise most slaves chose, I'm going to try to just slow down the work. I'm going to try to rebel a little bit and without really putting myself in a whole lot of danger, meaning I'm going to work slower. I'll slow down my work. I will break my tools so that they have to be fixed constantly. I'll find a way to slow down the work so I'm not working as hard. Of course, the result is if I'm caught doing that, I could be whipped or beaten again. Third choice was I'm going to work so hard that hopefully they'll see how hard a worker I am, how good a worker I am, that they'll promote me to jobs on the plantation that are not as they won't wear me down as quickly. Those 16-hour days in the field, guys, that really wore their bodies down quick. Like I told you in class, 30 to 40 years old, they were spent. If you were a field worker, you just didn't have the strength to do that work anymore. It wore your body out literally. So if I can get out of that by working really hard now, maybe they'll move me up to a different position in the plantation where I won't have to work as hard. Well, that's good. I mean, really, yes, you won't be working quite as hard. It's not going to be that physical labor. But we talked about the fact that the other end of that is you lose some of that community because the slaves who are out in the field still working, if you're put in a position above them, they aren't going to want anything to do with you, and that destroys that family or community feeling that they had brought with them from Africa. So you may not be part of that, and you're going to have to live with that. The other thing is the closer you got to the great house. On the plantation, remember we said, the closer you got to the great house, the closer your job brought you there. Yes, in a lot of ways you're treated, you get better clothing because you're going to be seen more, and you're not doing that hard physical labor out in the field in the sun and the cold and whatever else is going on. But the trade-off was, again, you're now working 24/7. If you're working in the kitchen, if you're working in the house, if you're working around the house or in one of the, not businesses, but one of the more trade-skilled jobs around the house, you're not going to have much time to yourself. You're working 24/7. You're working every day of the week because anytime there's a need in the house, you have to be there to take care of it. Plus, you're looked down on by the field workers because, again, they see you as not working as hard as them, that you've taken a position higher than them where you may be looking down on them a little, and that's a sense. And so you do get that split in community again. And that's just, that's the way the community works, whether we want to admit it or not. If you are working in the house, you were seen as being someone who really didn't understand the rest of them, that you would kind of try to move away. So if you're a slave and you're working in the house, you're giving up some of that sense of community. Plus, you've really given up a lot of your time because, unlike the field workers who would get Sundays off, and they would have that sometimes for the holidays and other times where they could come in and take part in those type of activities, you're taking care of what's going on in the house. That's still your job no matter what's going on. So, okay, so there's always, in a dilemma, there's always a price, remember. There is no good answer where you come out a winner in a dilemma. You're just going to take what you consider the less of the three evils in this case. Okay? All right, so just for practice now, tell me about number 6. Okay, and hit pause and do that. You can always go back and check this. Number 7. And number 8. Okay? If you want to check these, go back to where I started talking about them, and you can review it if you're not sure if you had the right answers. Hopefully this helped you out. Have a good evening, and I will see you tomorrow.